So while you guys are getting settled, I'd like to formally introduce our first panel. We'll now welcome to the stage Maya Lang, who's the Chief Policy Officer at Sick Cells. Speakers Mike Callahan, Andrew Campbell, and Norris Turner, who are going to have a really great discussion to lay the foundation of the conference with a great discussion on the therapeutics landscape and clinical trial overview. Welcome, guys.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're excited to kick off this event with the panel. It is my pleasure to join these three gentlemen on the stage to talk about the importance of the therapeutics landscape and clinical trials. And so we're going to jump right in. We heard a lot from Ashley this morning around how drug trial innovation or therapeutic innovation impacted her family. Our audience today is primarily warriors and caregivers. Oftentimes, people want to know what therapeutics and clinical trials are available to them. What is it important? What do they need to know about therapeutics and clinical trials? And what does that process look like for someone who doesn't understand or have exposure to it today?
Well, thank you, Drew Campbell from Children's National Hospital. The first thing I would say is clinical trials is trying to test a new therapy that may be effective in that patient population with very close safety guidelines and what's called data safety monitoring board or some type of safety monitoring board that really makes sure that the study reaches all of its goals and making sure it's very safe. Generally, clinical trials are for a patient population where there are not enough therapies that are effective enough to change the trajectory of their clinical illness in general.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mike Callahan. I'm a senior medical director at Agios Pharmaceuticals and used to work in sickle cell clinic in Detroit and have been involved in quite a few clinical trials on both sides of that. I think there's a lot of things that people need to know if they're going to get involved in clinical trials. I think one, it's incredibly important that people participate in clinical trials. Without them, we won't have new therapies. But it's also important that we have, we call it informed consent, but people really need to know what they're getting involved in. Why are they doing the trial? What are the risks of the trial? What are the potential benefits of the trial? What are the responsibilities of being in the trial? What do I have to do every day? How long is this going to last? What do I do if something doesn't go how I expect it to, or if I'm going to miss an appointment or I lose my medicine? All of these kind of things I think are practical things people need to know. I think some other important things to know are, it's scary being in a trial. It's a new medicine. We're testing it out. We're trying to figure out if it works. But that's not the first step. That's step 5,000 or something. So the development of drugs starts from really learning about the science and trying to come up with an idea of how you can help a disease and taking that through a lot of laboratory work in animals to make sure that the medicine has some ability to be safe and that it has a high potential to work. And then usually trials in healthy volunteers, we call it, where we see, does a low dose cause side effects? Can we go a little higher, a little higher? At what level does the drug start doing what we hope it does? And then it goes into trials in people. And usually these are very small trials, usually short trials. They're called phase 1 trials. And then if it works in that, then it goes into larger trials. So I think knowing what stage you're at, what's known about the drug, but also knowing that you're not the guinea pig. We already tested on a guinea pig. If it's gotten to this point, there's a thought that there's going to be some potential benefit, and we know a lot about the safety already. but it is a clinical trial, and until you try it in a large group of people with the disease that you're studying, you won't really know all of the side effects. So you should know, what you're getting yourself into and the risks.
Yeah, hi everyone. Norris Turner. I'm president and CEO of Turner Healthcare Quality Consulting, my own consulting business. In my more recent years, I've been advising pharmaceutical companies on strategy as a function of a lot of the changing healthcare landscape around policy, equity, and value-based care in particular. How we improve population health and improve metrics and things like that. But most of my career, I'm a pharmacist by training, a PhD scientist, and most of my career I was doing clinical trials, which has brought me here. And I love the commentary from both Drew and Mike. And just to kind of add on to that, certainly one of the things I love about Sick Cells that Maya emphasized was the audience. Many of you are people who are living with sickle cell disease or caregivers or people who represent the population. And one of the things that I saw over most of my time when we're sitting, within the company walls, planning the trials, the elements that Drew and Mike were alluding to, it was so little was it informed by the people who we were doing those trials to enroll them in those studies. And I can only imagine, the kind of challenged experiences that some of the patients had. Most of the trials I was involved in were in patients who had severe mental illness. So depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, also very challenged populations for many reasons. So I'm so thrilled that now, the industry has a burden. How do we do what Drew and Mike described very responsibly, credibly, because the patients are assuming a risk, right? On the kind of contract that there'll be a potential benefit while understanding the risks as informed, as Mike described, by the informed consent. But I would say you all play an important role too. I've heard stories. I was at the reception last night. I have friends who've talked about when they've been in trials, they've had to advocate for themselves. And when they do that, it makes a huge difference. When you just kind of enter into a trial and you're just told information about things, there's going to be things that site, as much as they may be trying to do all the things we know the process kind of adheres to, that they're missing, that can compromise the outcome of the trial, you all's experience, and others. So I'm just really excited about, how we bridge the gap between the role you all play in informing them and the responsibility we all bear in, designing them and conducting them.
Thank you. You've all touched on elements of safety, and I want to continue to drill down on this point. We've seen different therapeutics on the market. We've seen some therapeutics not on the market. We've learned a lot from different clinical trials. Words like safety and efficacy, can you break that down just a little bit more for the audience? So when we talk about efficacy, what does that mean?
Start. When we talk about efficacy, we mean how well does the drug work in the trial. So usually we pick things we call endpoints, and these are really important and really a challenge in sickle cell in particular. And we say, do the people who get the medicine have an improvement in that endpoint compared to people who don't get the medicine? That could be something like, did your hemoglobin go up? Did you have less pain episodes? And if we meet that, then we say the drug's efficacious. It worked in the trial. And obviously that's very important, but it also has to be safe. So safety takes a really long story. It starts with, testing in animals and toxicology studies, but really most important during the clinical trials, anything that happens. Like if you get a cold and you're not on a clinical trial, it's a cold. If you get a cold and you're on a clinical trial, that's an adverse event. It doesn't have to be from the drug. It's just anything bad that happened during the trial. And then it's the job of the investigator and the team to say, could that be from the drug? Does it happen more when people are taking the drug than when they're not? And that allows us to put together a safety profile to say, if you take this drug, these are the things you could expect might happen. this is how frequently they happen, so you know how safe the drug is. Additionally, a lot of times these studies, we don't know if you're on the medicine or you're on the placebo. We call it blinded. So we have a committee of experts, usually doctors who work in that area, who work with statisticians, and they're looking at the data throughout the study, and they can tell us, oops, something good or something bad is going on, and you need to change the study, you need to stop the study. So we call it an independent data monitoring committee that's watching safety while we're blinded and we can't.
Yeah, so no, that was a great foundation. And I would say one of the things that trials are, and I think Mike alluded to this in his first comment, the trials are it's a small sample of the people who are living with the disease in the general population. And so, Mike alluded to it, in the early stages, the sizes of the studies, each study is very small. Like in phase 1, it could be less than 100. Phase 2, it could be 100, 150, and depending on the prevalence of the disease at phase 3, you can get into the hundreds or thousands potentially. But still, relative to the prevalence of the disease in the general population, the number of people who are studied in the trials is small relative to when it gets out there. So you have this very limited, as rigorous as the assessment is of safety, there is still a requirement to assess safety after the drug's approved. And that's called post-marketing safety surveillance. I mean, if you work for a pharmaceutical company, like when I was at Johnson & Johnson, you're trained at the beginning. Like, Mike, this is the case for you at Agios right now. Like, if somebody at a party or a gathering mentions something, oh, I was on one of your drugs and, and this is what happened, I lost too much weight, he has an obligation to report it. That's part of the post-marketing safety surveillance. And certainly with the therapies for these innovative therapies for CGTs, cell and gene therapies for sickle cell, post-marketing safety surveillance is a very, very critical part of the picture. And equally, you want to be assessing efficacy also. And, there's folks who are looking at efficacy post-approval as well. So how well is this really working?
Thank you. Dr. Campbell, could you speak a little bit to this as it looks in practice? I know being clinicians, seeing individuals on clinical trials or receiving the therapeutics, what does safety and efficacy look like in that context for you?
So I'll give an example for sickle cell. So let's say a drug that you are giving is supposed to lower the amount of pain crisis. So let's say a patient who's having, let's say 10 pain crises per year. And they have a drug that can potentially lower that pain crisis. So we would approach the patient and say, hey, there is a drug that potentially could lower your pain crisis. And the first thing they would say is, absolutely, I'm very interested. But it's important for the clinician to say, however, here's a safety profile as we know it. So by the time it's like a phase 2 trial, we call phase 3 trial, where they start to test it in patients to see how well it's effective, you have to read the side effects. So in the consent form, now these consent forms are like 30 pages, they're very thick, they're very dense. But one of the things that I do, I go through every side effect because we know what the drug is doing, right? It's trying to lower, and we talk about the mechanism, but I pause and go over the safety profile. I also give them the consent to go home and read. I never consent them the same day. Sometimes I email them the consent, so when they come back with questions, then I'll answer them. So one of the things I would say is, the side effects. So if they're having a lot of stomach issues, for example, and this drug decreases their pain crisis, but they're already having stomach issues, they're having nausea, some abdominal pain, whatever, I'm going to say, well, this drug might make that worse. So we balance the risks and the benefits. And I would say that 9 times out of 10, most of our patients are willing to, go on the trial, given the, the accepted risk, adverse profile, the adverse or the risks that is listed in the consent form. The second point I would just make is during the clinical trial, we also ask them, how their side effect profile is doing. So if they're having any other symptoms throughout the profile, they might have, like, for example, I had a patient who was doing very well in one clinical trial, was having another side effect. I said, well, I want to, stop you, maybe take you off the trial because I think the side effect is worse than the clinical benefit. So sometimes as a clinician, you have to intervene and say, I think this is not good. So sometimes you have to take them off the trial. At the same time, the patients might say, well, I really benefit from this drug, so I really want to continue it. I'll deal with the side effects. So it's really a shared decision-making process, but keeping in mind you don't want to cause harm, so that risk and benefit ratio is very equal.
Different individuals are going to benefit from different therapeutics. We find this a lot with sickle cell. We don't know exactly what is the appropriate profile for one therapeutic versus the other. How can patients think about the landscape of what's available to them, both at each phase of the trial, recognizing, one, that participation in trials helps to inform whether or not we can move things forward, but also as things are on the market and patients are trying to consider whether or not something is right for them. For example, we know that there's a lot around cell and gene therapy and whether or not those are appropriate for individuals. But it's also asking or encouraging people to think about what other therapeutics are out there that might also work for them when one doesn't. What are some things people should think about when they think about the sickle cell therapeutic landscape?
I mean, I can just start with saying that, if we are, like you mentioned, Maya, in this stage of healthcare where we have incredible innovation at the level of understanding the molecular, genetic, cellular basis of disease. So that means that for new therapies and reflectively in the trials, there's very specific aspects of the population that you can hone in on based on, like, say, a certain genotype or a genetic marker for people who are living with sickle cell disease or people who have my diabetes. In the past, it would be everybody who has diabetes over an A1C of this, right? It would be very broad. Now it can be very narrow. So then maybe if, say, for instance, where you have a trial, the results come out, it's a new drug for people who have the disease you have, and you're like, wow, that's something that's going to be good for me too, probably. And then you realize, oh no, I don't have that genetic subtype. So there is a reality of understanding, and that's why forums like this are so important for people in the population who are living with certain illnesses to understand the state of trials at this particular, era we're living in, and how they understand what they need to bring to it, and also where they can connect in with their therapeutic journey.
Yeah, I think it's very important to, as a person living with sickle cell, to surround yourself with a team of people you trust, and that's, relatives, also your healthcare provider team, and really gather information about what are the options, what are the pros and cons of each one. And in terms of tailoring treatments for studies on the pharmaceutical side, we want our drugs to work. So we want to put them in the best position to work. So often that means selecting an endpoint that we think we're going to have a benefit on, selecting a group of patients who meet certain criteria, maybe have enough pain episodes so that we can see a decrease in pain episodes, or maybe have specific symptoms that we think our drug can benefit so we can see that benefit. Often that winds up in the drug label, and it says, this is for people with these symptoms. Doctors have the ability to use it not in that group. Sometimes they have to fight with the insurance company, but then it hasn't been studied too. So I think that's where, you really need this team of people who know you, who know about what's available and can provide you with information and tailor, that treatment decision to you. I think even outside of, does the drug work for you? When it comes to clinical trials, you also have to think about what that's going to involve. So I have a trial going right now. You have to come in 10 times in 12 weeks. at a lot of places, those are going to be long days that might not work with your job schedule. So as you talk to the team, you can get a sense of, is this something I can participate in, or do I need to wait until, it's available in another setting, and this other therapy works better for me now.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to a point that you made, Dr. Callahan. But Dr. Campbell, I know our audience is primarily patients and caregivers, but I do think there's an opportunity to speak to providers here about the therapeutic landscape and clinical trials. And you're very versed and engaged, especially when it comes to sickle cell. As a provider, how do you make sure that you're aware of what that landscape looks like to help engage and educate your patient population?
Yeah, I think first, just being involved in clinical trials. I think first starting at your institution to see, can you do a phase 1, but most importantly, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. Get input from your patient population. We have parent support group, we have a parent advisory board, and just talk to your patients. It's like, the therapies that you have right now, is it working? Right? We know we've had hydroxyurea for many years until there are other therapies that are available. So first I would say, be informed by your patients, our warriors. They'll tell you, like, we need more treatments. That's number one. So I learned from my patients, number one. So I can tell you very easily that we need more therapies. Number two, I would say that, go to meetings like this, Therapeutics Conference. I would say that go to conferences, sickle cell conferences that involve sickle cell studies. So American Society of Hematology, other conferences throughout the United States and also around the world, just to talk about, and the SCDAA and others, just to say that if you're not aware of sickle cell clinical trials, these are the conferences that they're going to showcase. So if you really want to learn. 3, I would say, talk to someone and talk to a center or provider who actually are doing clinical trials, and ask them, like, how is it to run a clinical trial? And ask them, like, what's the burden? Because a lot of time as providers, we're very busy. So that's something else. So running clinical trials, you add additional time as a provider. They don't pay you more to do clinical trials. A lot of people don't know that. It's just you gotta carve out time that in your already busy schedule. So sometimes you have to reach out to other providers in your clinic. Like our APPs are involved, for example, for clinical trials, for example, and to help with the clinical trials, because sometimes you're busy. And lastly, I would say for providers that we need more therapies for our warriors. And even the therapies that we have, can we improve upon those therapies? And I think we're at a point right now that we really need to find this. So there's going to be some trials and tribulations in terms of through that journey, but I think we need more therapies in general.
Thank you. So we're going to round out, and then we're going to open for questions shortly. But the last thing, and you'll hear me talk about this a lot today, is the importance of therapeutic innovation. Dr. Callahan, you mentioned just how you kind of evaluate good fit. Sometimes we think about therapeutics that are explicitly marked for sickle cell, but there's opportunities from existing therapeutics that are in the market that may benefit a sickle cell patient that may not be marked for as a sickle cell therapeutic. Could we talk about how innovation doesn't necessarily include a net new development, but where we could look at the expansive landscape of therapeutics as options for individuals with sickle cell?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think it's really important. Certainly, sickle cell manifests in so many different ways, and people living with sickle cell have disease manifestations that could be headaches, and maybe headache therapies could help there. It could be pain, and new pain therapies could help there. It could be kidney disease, and things that are being used in other kidney diseases could be beneficial there. I think the thing that's really challenging is because it's not a huge population. There's maybe 100,000 people in the U.S. living with sickle cell. There's not going to be that many people with sickle cell in any of those trials. So it may not have been well tested in those trials. But there is probably a big opportunity there to help patients. And I think a lot of this comes down to the art of medicine and guys like Drew taking care of their patients and saying, this is working in another field and you have symptoms, we could try it, and then sharing that information. And if it's, a common enough symptom, maybe even doing trials in people with sickle cell. These are often hard to fund. They're often small center trials. So I think we talk a lot about the big pharmaceutical trials, but there are certainly a lot of investigator-initiated studies at individual centers that try to answer questions like these, and they're really important. So I think, participation in those is really important too.
And, one of the things I think that can help foster that, because there's probably not tons of examples where you go, oh, that can be used for this. And, it was something that was completely out of mind before. But I do believe that there can be things that kind of are surprising developments you can have if you have the right kind of community of communications and engagement. I mean, part of it is we've spoken to that, and having the audiences of the people who are living with the illnesses, informing the science and how their experiences have been in those trials for the people like Mike who are developing them, so they get a feedback loop on how was that experience from the previous trial and trials we were doing, so it can inform the future ones. Also, things like, I remember when we would finish trials, I'm always a big proponent of, well, if you enlist the support and engagement of folks, boy, you sure should return back to them and tell them what that was like when it's all done. And I remember many trials would be done, and we wouldn't really engage the investigators, the doctors like Drew who were enrolling the patients. And, I would be like, we're moving on to the next trial, and we didn't talk to all those folks, all their experiences and what they learned from their day-to-day engagement with the patients. So, I used to make a big priority of, no, we're going to go meet with the investigators, talk to them about the results, because what a lot of pharmaceutical companies will do is they'll have one or two of the 30 or 40 investigators who are the authors in their papers, and they'll be engaging with them. But I feel like there's a huge opportunity lost when you're not talking to the folks who've had that experience to inform, future experiences.
Thank you, Norris. I think to that point, we're going to start to wrap up. I'd ask you all just what should people take away, maybe just one-liner from each of you, as we talk about the therapeutic landscape and clinical trials from what we've talked about today, and then we'll open for questions to the audience.
I would say this has been talked about, but I think we need to include all sickle cell patients, all the genotypes. A lot of our clinical trials only focus on SS, S beta 0. We do not have enough for sickle beta thalassemia plus or SC. So every time I look at a clinical trial and I look at the inclusion criteria, SC and S beta thal plus is not. So 25 to 30% of our population does not have enough therapeutic options. So that's one thing, a message for our pharmaceutical companies and those who are creating clinical trials to include those warriors. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here and that we're having a meeting like this. I think it's so important. Like Nora said, a lot of times, pharmaceutical companies are working in a vacuum. So having these interactions and learning both ways what the companies are up to, but also what's important in trials to physicians and to people living with the disease is really important. I think one thing is becoming more of an industry standard, and it's something we've taken pride in, is having meetings with patients all through the development of our programs. And sometimes that's a uncomfortable conversation where we say this is why we can't do that. But I think people understand then and appreciate, makes more sense. So I think, it's great to have meetings like this and have these conversations.
Yeah, and I would say the one thing would be, probably this is a guess on my part, but the people here are probably in the more progressive segment of whether you're a person living with the disease or caregiver or even some of the industry representatives. But to get the word out, in your circles of influence, to how do you help convey those messages to folks who aren't as progressive, who don't think about pushing the boundaries and expanding in ways that we know we need to, but we also see there's a status quo thinking in a lot of places. So, we're like the evangelists.
First of all, thank you. We'd now like to open up for questions. Don't run to the mic. Here's one up front with.
Thank you.
Not yet.
Sing with it.
There you go.
Oh, there it is. Pointing toward my face. No. Thank you. And I have a question. Well, two. One is, when you come up and you're testing a new drug, I know there's certain things that you have to say that this is what you expect to happen, right? And what I've found is that there are certain other things that happen that are really positive, right? So I'll just use the Endari, right? So it was lessening the amount of pain crisis, but it made such a difference in the energy level, right? And the fatigue, but yet nobody mentioned that. And so when I said, but why, that was the first sign for us that it was actually working. And I said, well, why can't you talk about that? That's what I asked the company. And they were like, well, it wasn't in our test. So I don't know if there's some way or something we can do about that, because it seems to me we need to also be capturing all the side effects, whether they're negative, not just the negative ones, but also the positive ones, because then that would then give our docs even more reason to enroll us, because many times they'll look at what it is it's supposed to do. For example, decrease VOC by 1 a year. And the doc is like, that's only 1, right? Now for us, we thrilled at 1, but if it said decrease VOC by 1 a year and increase daily energy or whatever, that would then be something they're more likely to
I'll just say one
enroll
thing
in.
and then let them expand as the experts in cell and gene is basically that, there's hypothesis testing. That's what you were talking about. Like there's a hypothesis that this drug will do this, and then you have the exact measure of that. But studies should also be hypothesis generating, right? Which means like, based on what we saw, something we didn't necessarily expect, then that should inform. Yes, you didn't study it for that reason, so therefore you can't put it in the label and talk about it, but it should inform future studies. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, that's the problem. I think one way to address that is put what we call secondary endpoints. Secondary endpoints is not the primary endpoint. Secondary endpoint is looking for improvements of symptoms. That is not like vaso-occlusive pain might be a primary endpoint, but fatigue would be a secondary endpoint. So I would say most of the clinical trials that I'm seeing now are including those. But I agree. I think the second point is obviously having our sickle cell warriors involved in the shaping of the clinical trials and what endpoints that needs to be measured. So I think that's the second point of mine is most important. Yep.
Any other questions?
I think I'd just add to that. I think we work in this regulated environment. So from the pharmaceutical company standpoint, There are things we would love to say that we can't say. Like, people in our trial felt a lot better and they told us, but FDA wouldn't let us say that unless we said up front, this is the thing we're testing, this is how we're testing it. And but we can learn from those things and add that into the next trial, or even for that drug, do another trial and capture those things. So it's really important to hear those stories. And that's my favorite part of my job, when one of the doctors on our study tells me something great that happened to a patient who's on our study. So I think, if you're having those things, share them. But probably for good, because people would take advantage of it if they could just say anything, but we're, regulated and unfortunately, unless we say up front, this is what we're going to do, we can't tell people about it.
Thank you. Good morning. Another great conversation. Good morning, Dr. Andrew. Your telepathy is strong this morning, because what I wanted to say is that providers and researchers have to change this idea that there is a severe and mild sickle cell. The difference is not whether or not SC is mild to SS. It's really a matter of frequency of vaso-occlusive crisis. But I can tell you, I know a number of people with SC who are having as many VOCs and are suffering and don't get the attention, don't get included in clinical trials like SS does, right? And in S-beta thal, it can go either way. I have S-beta thal and I lived 38 years crisis-free. But the ischemic damage, very quietly from hemolytic anemia, without the pain, was doing damage. And then one day it said, hello, remember me? I tried many times to get on clinical trials and was refused because I didn't have the classic 2 VOCs a year. I'm on one now because I happen to have it two in 1 week because of the conditions that I were in. I was in an ice box, and that was just the week before I was going to have the interview to see if I qualified. Had that not happened to me, I would have been rejected again. My experience in the clinical trial has been amazing. I've enjoyed the journey. And after going into open label extension, this treatment works. Too many of us are not getting the information from providers. If you're not in this space doing this and as an advocate, you don't know. I have been at trial sites where the clinical trial coordinators are not out in the areas with them handing pamphlets to the patients and telling them, did you know we have a trial? And even if they didn't, there isn't conversations. There are a number of trials. Would you like to learn about them? And let's see which one may work for you. I don't find hesitancy in our community. I find lack of information is the problem. And there are providers who think that there isn't a problem with diversity in clinical trials. And we're here to say that it is. And the other thing is, for trial designers, 2 VOCs a year should not be the earmark, because both third of the population who is not having crisis is still developing damage from this disease. And that should be a consideration. And the last thing you mentioned about the other research that's happening, we're happy that there's all of this research about raising the hemoglobin, but the comorbidities are not being addressed. And when we reach out to these other companies, we get no response. So I'm asking all of you that are up here to help us make inroads to these other companies like Jensen, that has 4 different clinical trials that would be, that are apropos for our disease. They're doing pulmonary hypertension. They have venous insufficiency. They have neurological, and I'm always forgetting the 4th one. But they have 4 different trials that our population could qualify for if they would even respond to us or consider us. And we need to get into those other things. It's desperate, because even with all of the hemoglobin raising, we're still dealing with the effects of those comorbidities.
Yes.
Thank you, Ginger. There we go. I think that's a great way to close. We're going to hear in our next panel from a patient educator who's going to talk about how to learn more about clinical trials, and we'll hear a lot more through the course of today around some of the other items that you addressed. So I think that's a great way for us to close, and I want to thank everyone on the panel today, and I'll see you all later.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.